All right, folks, in this video, I'm going to talk to you about the cerebral cortex. The cerebral cortex is this outer portion of the brain. If you look down upon it like we are here, it has a very kind of walnut look to it. Cortex, the word itself means bark. And so this is like a bark layer is on top of a tree. It's a very thin layer, just a fraction of a centimeter thick, and it coats kind of the outside of the brain. Now, sometimes people say, well, why is the outside of the brain so bumpy? Why does it have all these grooves all over it? And if you think about it like in terms of increasing surface area, that's what the brain is attempting to do. Many of our high level processing abilities come from the cortex, and so we need more space there in order to do what we do. And so to make that fit into our small skull, if you imagine taking 4 sheets of paper and putting them together, like kind of taping them together, that's about the surface area of the cortex. And then if you crumble up that paper, like you're going to throw it in the waste paper basket, and it still has the same surface area, but it's actually able then to fit in a smaller space. And that is what has happened with the cortex. It's become furrowed to help accommodate that surface area into our skulls. From this view, you see that there is this thing called the longitudinal fissure. It runs this way, the long way down the brain. You can imagine the face up here and the back of the brain back here. And divides this cortex into what we call 2 cerebral hemispheres. And so this is one hemisphere and this is the other. Here it is from the lateral view or the side view. This would be the front. In this case, over here, you'd have the nose and the eyes over here. And this would be the back part of the head, likely covered with hair. And we are going to look at this in an illustration that I've provided for you. If you haven't yet printed that illustration, you should go into Canvas and find it and print it so that you can do some labeling on it as we go. It'll help you learn the different parts of this cortex. Before we get going in detail into these different areas of the cortex, however, I'm going to tell you a little bit about the case of Phineas Gage. Now, Phineas Gage was a foreman on the railroad, and he was doing something one day involving explosives. And you know, the railroad can't go over dramatic bumps. It has to kind of smoothly go up a grade if it's going to climb or go down. And so one of the jobs of the foreman was to use explosives to get things out of the way. And so what they would do is they would tamp some gunpowder down, and they would set a fuse, and then they would explode that. And then they would clear the rubble away. And so he wasn't really kind of paying attention to what he was doing. I think he put the gunpowder in, and then instead of putting the sand on top and then tamping it down, he actually started tamping it, and when this metal rod struck the rock, then it ignited the gunpowder, and it shot it through his lower cheek here, and then up through his skull and out the front side. And this caused damage to his frontal lobe. And the frontal lobe, as we'll see, is in this front part of the brain. And the issue here was that, well, first of all, he recovered. As you can see from his photograph here holding the tamping rod that shot through his brain, he ended up kind of in the circus showing this off to make money later as his life went on, because he could no longer actually do his job anymore. So you see his eye is missing. Now, his problem with not doing his job didn't have to do with his vision. It actually had to do with his behavior. After this accident happened, he was described by his friends as no longer being Gage. He was different than he was before. He was vulgar. He would swear, he would curse, he would have temper tantrums. He just wasn't himself anymore. He wasn't able to control himself anymore in the way he had before. And so that led people in 1848 to start to become interested in what happens in that region of the brain. And we'll see later that there are very specific areas of the brain that are associated with very specific abilities. So let's look at some terms. Localization means that there are different functions in different areas of the brain. In other words, those functions have been localized. They have been placed over time in a specific area of the brain. Specific areas do specific jobs. This is localization. We also have lateralization. Lateralization means that for some functions, they are processed primarily on one side of the brain and not on both sides of the brain typically. We'll see this with language. Language is usually processed on the left side of the brain. For some people, it's processed on both the right and left, and for others, it's on the right side. But this is a very small proportion of people where it is processed on the right side. So now would be a good time to take out your image that I gave you, and we're going to do some labeling. So the first thing we're going to label is the frontal lobe. And the frontal lobe sits up here, and guess what? It is in the front. And so the frontal lobe is involved in our ability to plan for the future, what we call goal-directed behavior. Sometimes it's called executive function because it's executives who work in a business make all the big decisions and plan everything out for the future. And that's what this part of the brain does for us. We also have, so it takes up this space here, right in here. And we have the parietal lobe sitting behind it, and the parietal lobe is involved in sensation and processing sensory information from the body. Let's add a little more detail here. In front of this division, this fissure here, sits an area in the frontal lobe called the primary motor area. Now, motor means having to do with movement, and the primary motor area is set up for the body in terms of how we move, like our hand, our foot, our arm, everything. And our movement is dictated by this kind of strip of tissue right in this primary motor area. I'll show you a little more about how that is organized in just a minute on the next slide. So behind it, in the parietal area, sits the primary sensory area, also known as the somatosensory cortex. Now, soma means body. So this part of the word here, soma, in this case, means body. So this is the bodily senses. And it is also organized in a very particular way along this strip. Let me show you how that looks. So on this next slide, you see how one of these strips is organized. And what you're looking at here is a cross-section of the brain. This area goes down into that longitudinal fissure that I showed you in the beginning. So this is kind of out by where your ear is over here. And then this is the top of the brain, and then it goes down into that longitudinal fissure. So here you see that here's the genitals, the toes, the feet, hip, onto the trunk, the neck. They've drawn on where these various areas are getting their information from the body, or in the case of movement, how it happens with movement. And these two areas are very similar in kind of how they're organized, but they're a little bit different, but this gives you an idea of how it's organized. Your eye, your nose, your face, your lips, your mouth, and your tongue, and so on. Now, if we were to organize the human body to make it look like kind of how our sensory body is organized in terms of how many sensory neurons and how much sensory information comes in from the body, our body would look a little bit different. It would look like this. Notice what's big. The hands, a lot of sensory input, the tongue, the lips, the face. Now, this makes sense because if you think about the body, we use our hands for a lot of activities. And then we use our faces and our mouths for a lot of activities too, including eating and speaking. And then you see how the rest of the body just kind of is much, much smaller. And this representation is called a sensory homunculus. And this is just how we would look if our bodies reflected how much information and input we get from the sensory system in the body. Next on our list, I'm going to have you add in a little color in a little area in the front here. This is the prefrontal cortex. Now the prefrontal cortex, pre means in front of, so prefrontal is kind of at the very, very tip, the very, very front of this cortical frontal lobe. And this area is where we really do a lot of that high-level executive functioning, high-level planning, problem solving, stopping ourselves from doing behaviors that we shouldn't do. That's one of the key roles actually of the frontal lobe, is that the frontal lobe helps us stop ourselves from doing things we shouldn't. So not only does it guide us to do the things we should do, but it helps stop us from doing the things we shouldn't. Your boss says something rude to you at work, it's totally not true, and you want to punch that person in the face. And you don't, hopefully. You stop yourself. In other words, you inhibit that behavior. It may cross your mind, the impulse may be there, the muscles may be tensed, but you don't do it because it's not the right thing to do for your future. So the frontal lobe helps us with that. All right, let's do a little more labeling. Back here, the occipital lobe. The occipital lobe, if you think of the term ocular, this has to do with the eye. And so the occipital lobe processes information coming in from the visual system. In fact, some of these other lobes, the parietal lobe and the temporal lobe, also process visual information, but it shows up back here first. So it comes into a specific area back here in the occipital lobe, called the primary visual cortex. And primary means I get the information first. And so the information shows up here first from the visual system. It comes back down this pathway. It ends up here. And then for processing, it goes forward to the visual association areas where you're making sense of this information. And it even comes up into the parietal lobe and the temporal lobe as well for further processing. Our visual system is very important to us as humans. The next area is the temporal lobe, and the temporal lobe kind of sits in this area above the ear. Now this area above the ear kind of gives you a clue about its function. This area here, specifically in green that just popped up right here, is known as the primary auditory cortex. That's where information from the hearing system, the auditory system, comes in and is first directed to. So it comes in here, and then from there it goes to the auditory association areas, which are right along next to it. And so first it arrives, then it gets put to those association areas for further processing. So any area in the cortex that's called an association area is for further processing of whatever kind of information was brought in. Here's a few other things that you see here on this model that I've drawn for you. Here's the spinal cord right in here. It would continue down this direction. Now the responsibility of the spinal cord is to bring in information from the body, from the sensory world, and then to send directions to the body, out into the motor experience. What are you going to do in the world? You got this sensation, well, what does that mean? How should you respond? So the spinal cord's job is to carry these orders to and from the brain and out into the body, and vice versa. The medulla sits right in here. It's the first brain region you encounter as the spinal cord ends. It's really just kind of a swelling that starts at the ending of the spinal cord. And the medulla, also known as the medulla oblongata, is responsible for basic life sorts of functions, basic metabolic processes, breathing, keeping the body temperature right, basic things that you need to survive. That's why if we have an earthquake, what you're supposed to do is you're supposed to get under something that can protect you, and you're supposed to crouch down and cover kind of the back of your neck. It's not your neck here, it's kind of up in here. And the reason why is because if this area gets damaged, then you are in very, very serious trouble, because those are vital life processes, and without them, you cannot survive. Here, right behind it, sits the cerebellum, also known as the little brain. The cerebellum, sitting at the back of the base of the brain, is about the size of your fist, kind of sitting at the back. And its job primarily is coordinated movement. So the cerebellum is one of the first areas that's impacted by alcohol consumption. So if you've ever had to do kind of one of these alcohol tests when you've been driving, they have you get out of your car and they'll have you walk a straight line, and they'll have you stand on one foot and touch one nose and put the arms out to the side. Those are all highly coordinated movements. And if you've been under the influence of alcohol, they relatively quickly suffer from the exposure to this toxin. And so that's what you see in people that have problems with their cerebellum, or have problems because they've been, say, under the influence of alcohol. The cerebellum is also involved in other types of thinking, and just in recent years there's been some interesting research about how that may or may not work in the brain. But I'll just, let you know that, because you may read some articles about other functions of the cerebellum. Now, if you take your brain map here, we're going to draw in some other areas. And so the first area I'm going to have you draw in purple here, you can see it in here, is Broca's area. Now, Paul Broca was a French surgeon and neuroanatomist, and he started coming across these patients who had trouble with speaking, but they could still read and they could still understand spoken language, but they couldn't speak on their own. And so he figured out that it was this particular brain region that was damaged when these people had this problem. This became known as Broca's aphasia. So they can't really speak well, and I put can't speaking, that it should say can't speak. They can't speak well. And so they know now that this particular area is necessary for speech production. Now the next area, Wernicke's area, is a little bit different. Karl Wernicke, he was a German neurologist, and he was looking at patients too, and he noticed that some folks had trouble understanding speech. They could actually speak quite quickly, but they spoke in gibberish. They didn't make sense. In other words, they couldn't understand other people's speech, and they couldn't produce speech that was correct themselves. So in Wernicke's aphasia, they can't understand spoken or written language. They can kind of mutter and they can say things, but it's just gibberish. So their production is not having a problem in Wernicke's aphasia, but their comprehension is having a problem. Now, both of these, for most people, these areas are going to be on the left side. Occasionally, for people who are left-handed, it shows up on the right, or bilaterally, meaning on both sides. But for nearly everyone, these areas and their associated activities in terms of speech production and speech comprehension is on the left. I'm going to just point out another region to you as well that's talked about in the text, and this area is important in understanding some of the stuff with the split brain research, and that is the corpus callosum. And the corpus callosum sits, now this is a section of the brain. They cut the brain down the longitudinal fissure and you pulled it apart and you're looking at half the brain. And so this part here is the corpus callosum, and it's kind of white in color you see in this dead brain. And here it is from this section of the brain as well. So here it is right in this area. So you get kind of two different views of how it looks. And the corpus callosum is a band of axons, a whole bunch of them. And the reason they're all together is because that cortical region on the brain is made up mainly of cell bodies. And cell bodies are kind of grayish in color. And so these cell bodies make up this cortical space. And then the cell bodies are doing their jobs and they're sending messages all over the place. And they want to send messages across to the other hemisphere. Remember how we talked in the beginning how there are two hemispheres, a right hemisphere and a left hemisphere, when we talk about the cerebral cortex? And so what they'll do, and you can see the gray area along in here, it's a little bit darker in color. See how it follows these furrows? Remember that the cerebral cortex is like the coating or bark on a tree. And so here's this gray area, and then they're sending axons out and about to different places, and they're sending many axons across to the other side, and many axons across to the other side this way. And so it's white matter, or white in color, because it's sending these axons across that are myelinated. Remember from before we talked about myelination and how that's a fatty substance, and that fatty substance helps speed neural transmission. And so here we're getting fast, high-speed messages sent across from here across to the other hemisphere. When you read about the split brain procedures, you'll see that that corpus callosum gets cut right here, and that actually has fascinating implications about even consciousness, because we find that people that have this cut, they behave almost normally, but in a laboratory setting, they do very unusual things, and they actually show two separate streams of consciousness in the same person when the corpus callosum is cut. And so now we move on, and I just give you a little summary here. You should look at this picture and say to yourself, do these now sound familiar? Now, some of the terms that are used in this image that I picked out are not ones that I mentioned, but the others are very familiar. So you'll see here's the prefrontal cortex. This area is a somatic motor association area. It comes in here to the motor area, and then it's processed up here. Then you see the primary motor cortex right behind it. You see the primary sensory cortex right behind it in the parietal lobe. This is somatic sensory association area. It's brought in here, processed here further. And then back here in the occipital lobe, you see there is what is called the primary visual cortex usually, and then the visual association areas here, where it's brought in here, processed here. Here in this area, here's your primary auditory cortex, and then below it you see the auditory association areas. And then you also see Broca's area for your speech production, and Wernicke's area for your speech comprehension. I hope you enjoyed this video and that it was helpful to you. I think looking at the cortex kind of together as a whole, the different parts, the different pieces and how they're organized and how that kind of connects can be really helpful. You'll also have to do some investigating on the parts inside of the brain yourself.